It was a sun-drenched afternoon in early July, the kind of day where time seemed to stretch lazily over a quiet suburban neighborhood. The scent of freshly cut grass mingled with the faint hum of lawnmowers down the street, and children's laughter drifted from yards as they pedaled bikes along sidewalks. Birds circled lazily overhead, and the summer air carried a sense of ease and routine that often goes unnoticed until it is gone. For the Carter family, it was just another ordinary day. Inside the modest home, the kitchen window looked out over the backyard where 4-year-old Emily Carter played under the watchful eyes of the late-morning Sunday. She was a small, curious child with tousled blonde hair, always exploring the world with an intensity that her parents often joked would one day get her into trouble. That afternoon, she was chasing a butterfly across the lawn, stopping occasionally to pluck dandelions or inspect a bug crawling along the garden fence. Her mother, Karen, was just inside the house, leaning over the counter to wash dishes. She could hear Emily's tiny voice calling out, a sound so familiar and so comforting that for a moment she felt the ordinary pleasure of motherhood, warm, mundane, and safe. Minutes passed in that calm rhythm, the kind of minutes that feel almost eternal. And then, in the blink of an eye, the ordinary became the unthinkable. Karen turned from the sink and glanced out the window to check on Emily's progress in the yard, expecting to see the familiar sight of her daughter bending down to gather a flower or kick a ball. But the space was empty. Emily was gone. A sudden, inexplicable panic seized Karen. Her heart raced as she called out, her voice trembling, a mix of fear and disbelief. "Emily? Emily, where are you?" There was no answer. The backyard, once a sanctuary of summer simplicity, now felt impossibly vast, empty, and silent. Panic escalated as she ran to the door, flinging it open, her eyes scanning every corner of the yard. The garden gate, which had been latched just minutes before, now swung gently in the breeze, unlatched, an ominous portal leading to the unknown beyond. Karen's screams drew her husband, Michael, from the study, and within moments, the calm suburban afternoon was pierced by the chaos of a family desperate to locate a child who had vanished without a trace. Neighbors, alerted by the commotion, stepped outside, drawn by the sound of frantic voices. They watched helplessly as the Carters combed the yard and surrounding properties, the sense of disbelief palpable in every gesture. Calls to 911 were made within minutes, and local law enforcement arrived swiftly. But even their presence did little to quell the mounting fear. Initially, officers assumed the worst-case scenario of a wandering child who had simply ventured too far. They organized a perimeter, began shouting Emily's name, and called for backup. Dogs were brought in, their noses sniffing every inch of grass, flower bed, and shrub. But what the search teams discovered, or rather, failed to discover, was deeply unsettling. There were no footprints leading away from the yard. No evidence of struggle, no signs that anyone had entered or exited the property other than the small, unlatched gate. It was as if Emily had vanished into thin air. Helicopters were called in to survey the nearby woods that bordered the neighborhood. From above, the forest appeared dense, a tangle of trees and underbrush that could hide almost anything. Searchlights cut across the treetops as officers and volunteers coordinated ground searches, combing every path, every trail, every nook that a 4-year-old could possibly crawl into. Yet no sign of Emily emerged. Each passing hour magnified the tension, the quiet of the neighborhood now replaced by a heavy, almost tangible dread. Families who had been playing outside just an hour ago now kept their children indoors, whispering theories and fears that no one wanted to speak aloud. Detectives began door-to-door interviews, their questions probing the routines and behaviors of neighbors, anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual. They asked about visitors, deliveries, recent strangers, and even the rare passerby who might have wandered too close. Every story, every recollection, was cross-checked, but nothing added up. Some neighbors remembered seeing a figure near the fence moments before Emily disappeared, a vague shadow that might have been anyone or no one. Others insisted they had heard only the familiar sounds of a child playing. The discrepancy between these accounts created a growing unease among investigators. There was no clear timeline, no definitive witness, and no way to know exactly when or how Emily had gone missing. Inside the Carter household, the atmosphere was suffocating. Karen oscillated between frantic hope and crushing guilt, questioning every second she had spent away from her daughter. Every ringing phone, every passing vehicle, every stranger at the door became a source of terror. Michael, a man who had always prided himself on his calm and methodical nature, found himself unmoored, paralyzed by a sense of helplessness that gnawed at his chest. The police presence, meant to reassure, only amplified the surreal quality of the morning. Their backyard, once a familiar and comforting space, had been transformed into a crime scene, cordoned off and scrutinized as if the very grass and garden tools might hold the key to the puzzle. By mid-afternoon, the first whispers among investigators began to take shape. Experienced officers, seasoned in missing child cases, exchanged furtive glances and quiet conversations. "This wasn't an accident," one detective muttered under his breath, the words heavy with implication. Unlike typical cases where a child wanders and is later found close to home, Emily's disappearance offered no such simplicity. The lack of physical evidence, no footprints, no signs of struggle, no eyewitnesses pointed to something far more sinister. The garden gate, swinging gently in the breeze, became a symbol of the unknown, the fragile barrier between safety and terror. Throughout the neighborhood, the community began to react. Streets that had once been filled with laughter and mundane daily routines were now filled with the unspoken fear of parents watching their own children play. The local elementary school issued notices to keep children close, and informal neighborhood patrols began forming, families walking the streets in pairs or groups, scanning for any sign of Emily. In this suspended state of anxiety, even the most familiar spaces, the swing sets, the front porches, the quiet cul-de-sacs felt alien, hostile, and unpredictable. The first night brought with it a haunting quiet. Searchlights retreated, helicopters landed, and the last patrols returned home, exhausted and no closer to answers. Inside the Carter home, Karen and Michael sat in the living room, staring at the backyard through the large glass doors, grappling with an emptiness that had no physical form. The furniture, the garden gnomes, the meticulously tended flower beds all remained in place, as though time itself refused to acknowledge what had occurred. And yet, every shadow seemed to hold the memory of what had vanished. By the next morning, the search had intensified, expanding to neighboring towns and rural areas beyond the immediate vicinity. Law enforcement agencies coordinated with state police, dispatching, tracking dogs, interviewing transient populations, and examining every possible avenue for abduction. Each lead required careful investigation, yet the more time passed, the thinner the trail became. Even the slightest hope of finding Emily nearby began to wane, leaving the family clinging to the fragile belief that she might somehow still be safe, despite the mounting evidence suggesting otherwise. Within these first critical hours, a pattern began to emerge in the conversations among law enforcement. Experienced detectives noted that cases like Emily's rarely ended with a simple explanation. The absence of struggle and the mysterious gait created a chilling possibility that someone or something had acted with precision, aware of the routines of the household, perhaps waiting for the exact moment of vulnerability. The notion of randomness was stripped away. What remained was a deliberate, targeted disappearance. This realization marked a turning point, the moment when the neighborhood, the police, and the Carters themselves collectively understood that Emily's case was not an ordinary missing child incident. In the days that followed, the atmosphere of grief, panic, and confusion only deepened. Each neighborhood interview, each search of the surrounding woods, and each re-examination of the backyard reinforced the unnerving truth. Emily had disappeared without leaving a trace. Helicopters continued their slow sweeps over treetops, volunteers scanned the underbrush with flashlights, and investigators meticulously documented every detail of the yard, fence, and surrounding landscape. The small suburban street, once a place of safety and ordinary life, had transformed into a theater of fear and obsession, where every noise was scrutinized, every shadow questioned, and every movement of the wind became suspect. By the end of this first day, Karen and Michael were left in a state of numb disbelief. The backyard, the garden, the swings, and the flowers were unchanged, but the world they knew had shifted irreversibly. And as the detectives gathered evidence, interviewed neighbors, and tried to reconcile the inexplicable with the possible, one chilling thought took hold. Emily's disappearance was not a simple accident. It was something else entirely, something calculated, deliberate, and unknowable. And in that moment, the slow-burn terror of the unknown settled over the neighborhood, a shadow that would linger for years to come, shaping every step of the investigation and haunting every waking hour of those left behind. The morning after Emily's disappearance, the neighborhood that had once been a quiet, familiar place was transformed into a labyrinth of suspicion and unease. Every window seemed to hide secrets. Every car that drove past drew cautious glances, and every pedestrian became a potential witness or suspect. Police presence intensified, vehicles patrolling the streets like silent sentinels, their flashing lights a constant reminder that the ordinary world had fractured. Detectives established a command post in a local community center, walls covered with maps, photographs, and scribbled timelines attempting to piece together the events of the afternoon Emily vanished. The investigation expanded rapidly, moving beyond the confines of the Carters' backyard into every corner of the neighborhood, every alley, and even the forested edges of the nearby parklands. Officers began their door-to-door interviews, a meticulous, grueling process that consumed hours. Each family, each resident, recounted their version of the day, their routines, and what they remembered seeing or hearing. Every statement was dissected, cross-referenced with other accounts, and replayed against the emerging timeline. A teenage neighbor, home alone during the critical hours, became the first person of interest. She was questioned at length, describing her own afternoon of homework and music, insisting she saw nothing unusual. Yet her solitary presence left a sliver of doubt in investigators' minds. Next, a delivery driver whose route intersected the neighborhood around the time of the disappearance was interviewed. His logs seemed routine, his recollections precise, yet inconsistencies about exact delivery times raised eyebrows, and detectives probed deeper into his background. And finally, a reclusive older man living 2 doors down drew scrutiny. His odd routines, habit of wandering late at night, and the community's whispered unease made him an easy target for suspicion. Detectives spent hours combing his property, questioning him about any knowledge of Emily, but his alibi held firm, leaving no evidence to tie him to the disappearance. Each potential lead that initially promised answers collapsed under careful examination, leaving the case more confounding than before. The teenage neighbor's presence was explained with school and personal routines. The delivery driver's logs, once clarified, showed no gaps or suspicious behavior. The older man had spent the hours in a documented visit with a relative in a neighboring county. With every dead end, frustration mounted among officers and investigators. The feeling of urgency intensified, but the trail seemed to vanish into the very air Emily had once played in. It was as if the neighborhood itself had swallowed her, leaving behind only the cold, silent echoes of what had been. Tensions among the residents began to rise, a community once tightly knit now fraying under the weight of fear and suspicion. Rumors spread quickly. One neighbor claimed to have seen a stranger lurking near the Carters' fence. Another insisted the older man had been acting weird for weeks. Whispers about the delivery driver's timing coincidences circulated on social media, drawing attention and speculation from outside the small street. Parents who had once let their children play freely now kept them inside, and small children were watched with a vigilance bordering on paranoia. Friends turned into skeptics, casual acquaintances into wary observers. The social fabric of the neighborhood, once defined by trust and routine, was now a network of caution and whispered suspicion. Investigators, aware of the heightened tension, intensified their efforts. They began collecting surveillance footage from every home on the block, a patchwork of angles and perspectives that promised to provide insight into the moments before and after Emily's disappearance. Hours were spent watching the same segments repeatedly, frame by frame, each shadow and movement analyzed for inconsistencies or anomalies. The mundane became sinister. A car passing slowly down the street twice, a neighbor retrieving the mail at a seemingly innocuous time, the rustle of leaves along the fence line, all potential pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit. Detectives mapped every movement, cross-referencing times, vehicle license plates, and personal routines, hoping that somewhere in the sea of ordinary actions, a clue would emerge. Amid the careful investigation, small but unsettling details began to surface. A local hiker reported hearing a child's distant laugh from the edge of the woods bordering the neighborhood, a sound that didn't fit with the timeline but sent shivers down the spines of those who heard it. A discarded ribbon, pale pink and delicate, was discovered near a narrow path behind a neighbor's yard, leading to speculation that it might have belonged to Emily. Another witness claimed to have seen a tall figure standing just outside the Carters' yard near the swinging gate moments before the girl vanished. While none of these details provided clear evidence, each added a layer of mystery, a subtle, almost invisible thread that made the neighborhood feel increasingly surreal, as if ordinary life had been punctured by something incomprehensible. The detectives worked tirelessly, coordinating with outside agencies, and even bringing in specialists trained in child abduction cases. Every lead was pursued, every detail logged, but the investigation was hampered by the lack of concrete evidence. The absence of physical traces, no footprints, no signs of struggle, no fingerprints, other than those of the family, rendered forensic efforts frustratingly unproductive. Canvassing the woods turned up nothing definitive, the terrain offering both hiding spots and dead ends, and surveillance footage revealed only ordinary comings and goings, none of which could be definitively linked to Emily's disappearance. Reporters quickly descended on the neighborhood, amplifying tension and feeding the public's morbid curiosity. Cameras set up along the quiet street captured the Carters' grief and neighbors' nervous glances, broadcasting the image of a community in crisis. Headlines highlighted every rumor, every speculation, and every unverified account, creating a feedback loop where public pressure and media scrutiny collided with the painstaking work of the investigators. The Carters, already consumed by grief, now had to navigate a torrent of attention that only heightened their anxiety. The privacy of their home, once a sanctuary, had been replaced with the relentless gaze of outsiders, each person seeking to understand what had gone wrong when no explanation could suffice. Inside the command center, the investigators' frustration deepened. They were operating in a zone of uncertainty, where every lead raised new questions but yielded few answers. The teenage neighbor's detailed testimony, cross-checked with surveillance, created more questions than it resolved. The delivery driver's meticulously logged route suggested no opportunity for misdeeds, yet the timing coincided with Emily's disappearance. The reclusive older man's documented absence seemed ironclad, yet his odd behavior continued to draw suspicion. In a case defined by absence and silence, certainty was impossible. Each new piece of information seemed to fracture rather than illuminate, and detectives were left grasping at shadows, attempting to create a narrative where the facts refused to cohere. As days turned into weeks, the neighborhood remained under intense scrutiny. Community meetings were organized to share updates, reassure residents, and solicit any potential leads. Each gathering, however, underscored the collective anxiety that had gripped the street. Parents exchanged warnings, neighbors recounted sightings or sounds they had dismissed initially, and the boundary between vigilance and paranoia blurred. Children were kept close, windows were watched, and every unfamiliar sound prompted alarm. The sense of normalcy had evaporated entirely, replaced by an ever-present tension that infiltrated every interaction. Despite the relentless work of law enforcement, by the end of the second week, the case showed troubling signs of stagnation. Police admitted privately that they had no clear timeline, no abductor, and no reliable evidence. The leads that initially seemed promising had evaporated under scrutiny, leaving the investigation suspended in uncertainty. Every minor clue, the ribbon, the distant laugh, the shadowy figure, remained tantalizingly out of reach, like fragments of a story that refused to be told. The community, once confident and cohesive, had become a web of fear and conjecture, each person haunted by the possibility that a child could vanish so completely without explanation. For the Carters, the absence of answers was a living nightmare. Every day was marked by a cycle of hope and despair, the emotional weight of uncertainty pressing heavily on their shoulders. Karen's grief was punctuated by guilt and self-recrimination, a constant question of whether she had missed something, if a single second of inattention had made all the difference. Michael's disbelief had evolved into a quiet, simmering anxiety, a numbness that masked the fear he felt for his daughter's safety. The home, once a place of laughter and warmth, now echoed with emptiness. Emily's toys sat untouched. The backyard remained fenced and still, and the memory of her small presence haunted every corner. By the conclusion of these early investigative efforts, the neighborhood had become a place suspended between hope and dread, a microcosm of the uncertainty that defines missing child cases. Detectives continued to chase leads, interview witnesses, and analyze evidence, but the reality was increasingly stark. Without a concrete timeline, a verified suspect, or definitive physical evidence, the case risked going cold. The Carters, the neighbors, and the investigators were caught in a liminal space, waiting for a breakthrough that had yet to arrive. And in that space, the terror of the unknown settled like a shadow, a reminder that Emily's disappearance was no accident, but a mystery that refused to yield its secrets. The final realization, both for the community and for the investigators, was that the first days had set a precedent that would define the entire investigation. Emily had vanished without a trace, leaving only fragments of evidence, fleeting sounds, and fleeting glimpses to guide the desperate search for answers. The case would linger in the minds of everyone involved, a haunting puzzle that challenged assumptions, disrupted lives, and refused to allow closure. In the quiet moments, when the neighborhood seemed calm, the absence of a little girl's laughter became deafening, echoing through the streets, a constant reminder that despite all efforts, some mysteries resist resolution. As the search expanded beyond the neighborhood streets, the team of investigators, volunteers, and cadaver dogs pushed deeper into the dense wooded area behind Emily's home, a stretch of forest that local children rarely dared to enter. The trees were tightly packed, their thick canopies filtering sunlight into mottled patterns on the uneven forest floor, and every step seemed to sink into a mixture of leaves, mud, and decaying twigs. What had once been a place of fleeting adventure, where children occasionally chased stray balls or explored small clearings, now became a labyrinth of shadows and uncertainty. Helicopters circled overhead, their rotors whipping loose branches and sending leaves spinning into the air, while on the ground, teams combed systematically through thick underbrush, hoping to find anything that could explain the girl's sudden disappearance. The smell of damp earth and decay was strong, an almost physical reminder that the forest was indifferent to human concerns, that it had swallowed countless secrets long before Emily's name became part of its story. Cadaver dogs, trained to detect human remains, were brought in with the highest expectations, and for the first time, there were signs of promise. Twice, the dogs alerted, ears perked, bodies tense, their behavior indicating a scent that might be human. But despite the hopeful stirrings, each alert ultimately ended in disappointment. Investigators scoured the flagged areas meticulously, lifting branches, sifting through mud, and checking every hollow and indentation. Nothing was found. The creek that ran through the heart of the woods became a particular obstacle, shallow yet treacherous, filled with debris, half-submerged branches, and thick, sticky mud that clung to shoes and made movement exhausting. The water had collected years of discarded refuse and natural sediment, turning every step into a trial and making it nearly impossible to follow any potential trail. The creek's meandering course seemed to mock the searchers, its calm surface hiding uncertainty, its muddy banks hiding any trace of Emily's passage. In one small clearing, the team stumbled upon an abandoned shed, its boards rotting, its roof sagging and partially collapsed. Inside, they found nothing of significance, just broken tools, animal nests, and a scattering of leaves, but the mere act of exploring it pulled the volunteers further into emotional exhaustion. Hours passed as they inspected every corner, every inch of the surrounding forest, yet each potential lead seemed to dissolve into the indifference of the natural world. The psychological toll of the search began to weigh heavily on both the professionals and the volunteers. Faces that had been tense with hope began to show fatigue. Eyes grew hollow from long nights and unbroken worry, and every false alarm chipped away at the fragile optimism that had driven the early days. Even the most experienced detectives, hardened by years of missing person cases, found themselves confronting a creeping dread that perhaps this time the case would offer no closure. Emily's parents clung to the smallest threads of hope, revisiting the backyard, the neighborhood, and the forest edges daily. Karen would often stand silently in the yard, staring at the garden gate that had swung open the day Emily disappeared, as if willing it to offer answers. Michael retraced paths he imagined Emily might have taken, calling her name in the early hours of dawn when the streets were quiet. They coordinated with volunteers, checked on new sightings, and revisited every rumor, every whispered account, desperate for anything that might bring her home. Yet behind their attempts at hope, detectives began having the difficult conversations that no parent wants to hear. Privately, they explained that while every effort was being made, the odds of finding Emily alive were diminishing with each passing day. The careful, professional detachment required by law enforcement clashed with the parents' emotional need for reassurance, creating a delicate and painful balance of truth and empathy. Amid the methodical search, local volunteers discovered something strange near the creek. Footprints, half hidden in mud and scattered leaves, suggested movement from the edge of the woods toward the water's flow. But they were unusual. The prints were small, no adult shoe size matched, and yet they didn't match any known animal in the area either. For days, investigators dismissed them as distortions caused by the mud, overlapping impressions, or even children who had wandered through the forest earlier. But the persistence of these prints, their peculiar alignment, led to a quiet, cautious re-examination. Specialists in tracking were brought in to evaluate them, measuring stride lengths, depth, and width, trying to determine if they could have been Emily's or if they indicated the presence of someone else entirely. The results were inconclusive, leaving a lingering sense of unease, proof of movement, yet no clear connection to the missing girl. As the weeks turned into a month, the scale of the search began to contract. Helicopters stopped hovering so close, volunteer teams thinned, and authorities shifted focus to broader investigative methods. Canvassing leads, checking digital activity, and following up on potential sightings beyond the immediate neighborhood. The forest itself, once combed meticulously, was now only patrolled sporadically. It became, in the minds of investigators and the community alike, a metaphor for uncertainty, vast, unyielding, and indifferent. Its dark corners seemed to swallow not just the possibility of finding Emily, but also the psychological fortitude of everyone involved. To the Carters, it was no longer just a stretch of land, it was a living reminder of absence, a silent witness to a day that had forever altered their lives. Throughout the shrinking search, Emily's disappearance began to join the grim statistics of unsolved missing child cases. Each day that passed without new evidence became another number in national and regional reports, a symbol of the countless children who vanish and leave only shadows behind. Detectives, while maintaining professional composure, quietly acknowledged the reality that many cases like this fade into uncertainty. The forest, with its dense canopy, muddy creek, and abandoned shed, would never tell its full story, its silence as unyielding as time itself. The emotional weight for the family reached its peak as the official search was scaled back. Karen and Michael were left to navigate grief and frustration with a mixture of defiance and helplessness. Karen continued to organize small search parties, walking the edges of the woods daily, clinging to every whispered clue or unverified sighting. Michael focused on supporting his wife and the volunteers, yet his own despair was evident in moments of quiet reflection, when the absence of Emily in their home became almost unbearable. Friends and extended family tried to provide comfort, but there were no words to bridge the gap between hope and reality, no actions to recover what had been taken in a matter of minutes. Even the small neighborhood community, now scarred by fear, could not entirely detach from Emily's story. The swings at the park went unused. Children were shepherded under watchful eyes, and conversations between neighbors revolved around what might have been missed, what could have been seen, or what strange occurrence might have gone unreported. The simple rhythm of life had been disrupted, replaced by a pervasive anxiety and a sense of vulnerability that extended beyond the immediate family. Everyone who had once felt a measure of safety in familiar streets now recognized that the ordinary could conceal extraordinary danger, that even a sunny backyard could become the scene of unthinkable loss. For the investigators, the forest became a study in frustration and the limits of human perception. Every potential lead was carefully logged, every anomalous detail scrutinized, and yet nothing congealed into actionable evidence. The cadaver dog's alerts, the footprints, the abandoned shed, and the creek, all promising initial sparks, dissolved under closer examination, leaving the case suspended in ambiguity. For law enforcement professionals accustomed to finding at least fragments of truth, the absence of evidence was a bitter lesson in patience, uncertainty, and the limits of even the most exhaustive search. As the investigation transitioned from active search to case management, Emily's disappearance remained unresolved, the forest standing as a silent monument to the unknown. The woods had swallowed more than just footsteps. They had absorbed hope, sowed doubt, and imposed a weighty reminder that some mysteries refused to be solved. Karen and Michael, while devastated, refused to let the forest claim their resolve entirely, maintaining small acts of remembrance and vigilance. The possibility of discovery, however slim, persisted in every whispered rumor, every faint clue, and every visit to the wooded perimeter. In the minds of the family and investigators, the case was not closed, the forest not conquered, and the question of what truly happened to Emily remained suspended in the air, as thick and impenetrable as the woods themselves. By the end of the third week, the forest's role as a character in this tragedy became undeniable. Its unyielding presence, the muddy creek, the abandoned shed, and the small, enigmatic footprints all contributed to an overwhelming sense of indifference. Nature had not conspired against Emily, yet it had absorbed her disappearance as effortlessly as it had countless others, indifferent to the grief, hope, and fear that had consumed the community. The forest swallowed secrets in silence, leaving behind only traces, whispers, and the aching void of a child who had vanished without explanation. The emotional resonance of this phase of the case would ripple for years. The forest became symbolic, not just to Emily's family, but to every parent, investigator, and volunteer who had combed its edges. A reminder that sometimes the world offers no closure, that absence itself can be a presence, and that even the most diligent search may end in questions rather than answers. And while the forest continued its quiet existence, investigators and family alike were left with the persistent, gnawing need to understand, to resolve, and, most importantly, to hope against all evidence. 3 years had passed since Emily Carter disappeared, and in that time, the small suburban neighborhood had learned, in ways both subtle and devastating, the quiet agony of living alongside a mystery that refused to resolve. The first months had been a blur of urgency, of helicopters overhead, of search teams combing woods and creeks, and of a community united in fear and sorrow. But as months became years, the frenzy faded. The immediacy of Emily's disappearance receded into the slow, gnawing ache of absence. For her parents, Karen and Michael, time did not heal. It layered grief upon grief, each day another reminder of what had been stolen. They tried therapy together at first, clinging to the hope that structured guidance could help them process the trauma, that shared sessions might maintain the tenuous bond that had once carried them through ordinary arguments and household chores alike. But the shared pain, no matter how carefully unpacked, began to push them apart. What was once mutual anguish slowly transformed into private suffering. Karen found herself lingering in Emily's frozen bedroom, touching the edges of small dresses she could not bear to put away, or straightening the stuffed animals with a meticulousness born of desperation. Michael retreated into work, losing himself in hours that stretched long past sunset, in the hope that immersion could stave off the crushing emptiness at home. Even their therapy sessions, meant to bridge the gap, sometimes ended in silence, the air thick with unspoken blame, quiet resentment, and the echo of a daughter's laugh that no longer existed. The house itself began to change under the weight of absence. Emily's room remained untouched, a capsule of memory and longing. The walls bore the faint fingerprints of a child who had grown and vanished, the shelves a mixture of toys, storybooks, and half-finished crafts. Karen and Michael often walked past it slowly, eyes lingering on the details that spoke volumes. A doll left mid-play, crayons scattered in a pattern that made sense only to the tiny hands that had once used them, a calendar still marked with birthdays and milestones she would never reach. Friends and neighbors visited less frequently, unsure how to interact, uncertain whether conversation should include Emily or avoid it entirely. The room became both sanctuary and shrine, a constant reminder of failure, loss, and love. In many ways, it was easier for them to avoid the world than to face it, easier to let the memory of Emily exist in stasis than to confront the impossible fact that 3 years had passed without a trace. Meanwhile, the case itself had fallen into what detectives refer to as the cold zone. New officers were assigned to the file only to rotate off months later. Experienced detectives who had spent the initial frantic weeks scouring the woods and canvassing neighbors were moved to other investigations, leaving behind meticulous case notes and faded photographs. The official files sat in metal cabinets, collecting dust, punctuated occasionally by the thrum of a new phone call or an unverified tip from a concerned citizen. Over time, the urgency faded not because the disappearance was forgotten, but because the evidence refused to present itself. The trails had gone cold, the creeks yielded no secrets, and the forest behind Emily's home had resumed its indifferent quiet. Even seasoned law enforcement professionals acknowledged the cruel reality. Some mysteries simply linger indefinitely, leaving the people involved suspended in a limbo of grief, uncertainty, and faint hope. Yet, the town itself never fully recovered from the shadow of Emily's disappearance. 3 years later, a series of minor but unsettling events rattled the neighborhood. Reports of break-ins near the wooded area began to surface, windows left ajar, doors forced, small thefts of bicycles and garden tools. While none were violent, the pattern alarmed local law enforcement, and investigators reopened old maps, comparing the new incidents with the locations where search parties had combed every inch of forest and creek. Volunteers, now older and more cautious, joined in night patrols and coordinated with the police to observe any unusual activity. The old trails through the woods, particularly the areas near the abandoned creek, were examined with renewed scrutiny. It was as if Emily's presence, invisible yet undeniable, lingered in the undergrowth, and the town, sensing this latent tension, adjusted its routines accordingly. Children were kept closer to home, parents drove with headlights on, and a pervasive unease settled over streets that had once felt entirely safe. Amid this heightened vigilance, rumors began circulating once more. People spoke of fleeting glimpses of a girl in a white dress standing at the edge of the tree line, appearing at dusk only to vanish when approached. Some insisted it was their imagination. Others whispered it was Emily, or perhaps something that reminded them of her. The town's collective memory was haunted by the image of a missing child, and every shadow, every wind-blown piece of fabric, became a potential sign. Social media groups and neighborhood chats buzzed with speculation, recounting stories that were often contradictory but always tinged with fear and longing. The longer the case remained unresolved, the more the lines between reality and interpretation blurred. Yet the emotional weight of each reported sighting was real for those who believed they had seen something, anything, that could reignite hope. For Karen and Michael, these years of quiet despair became a test of endurance. They went through routines that allowed them to function: work, grocery trips, occasional social interactions, but their minds were tethered to Emily. Each rumor, each broken fence, each discussion of a girl in a white dress near the tree line pricked at the raw nerve of hope and fear. Every night, Karen would check the backyard gate, imagining Emily stepping through it, while Michael would drive the forest roads, scanning shadows and listening for sounds that might indicate a child's presence. Their shared grief was constant, a silent undercurrent running beneath every action, every conversation. Life continued outwardly, but inwardly, every decision, every emotion was colored by the unresolved trauma of their daughter's disappearance. Then, one ordinary evening, everything changed in a way no one could have anticipated. The air was cool, tinged with the faint scent of damp leaves, as the family walked their neighbor's dog, a golden retriever named Rex. He was an energetic, loyal companion, loved by the family and well known in the neighborhood for his keen instincts and playful nature. As they strolled near the edge of the woods, Rex suddenly bolted, ears forward, tail rigid, his body moving with a precision that suggested purpose rather than play. He disappeared into the brush, bounding over uneven ground, and the parents followed as best they could, hearts pounding in unison, nerves stretched tight with anticipation and dread. When Rex emerged moments later, he was carrying something small and familiar in his mouth, trotting confidently back to them. Karen's first instinct was disbelief. She squatted to take the object from Rex, her fingers trembling as she realized what it was. A tiny pink sneaker, the same brand, the same size, the same cartoon design that Emily had been wearing the day she vanished. The sneaker was scuffed from what appeared to be long exposure to dirt and moisture, but its authenticity was unmistakable. Michael's hands shook as he lifted it, examining the details he remembered so vividly: how Emily had loved the character printed on the side, how she had insisted on wearing the shoes herself, despite their minor tightness. It was a fragment of their daughter, a tangible piece of the day that had otherwise dissolved into absence. The shock, disbelief, and sudden surge of hope were overwhelming, leaving the parents momentarily speechless. The discovery instantly reignited the investigation. Police, previously constrained by cold leads and limited evidence, descended on the site of Rex's find. Forensic teams collected soil samples from the sneaker, analyzed fibers, and examined patterns of wear that might indicate where it had been carried or dropped. Volunteers returned to the surrounding forest with renewed vigor, scanning every inch for additional clues. The once quiet creek trail and abandoned wooded area were combed systematically once again. Each tree, shrub, and muddy bank inspected for the faintest trace of Emily's presence. Media outlets picked up the story immediately, amplifying the tension and the hope alike. The neighborhood, long subdued by the weight of time and unresolved grief, was suddenly alive with anticipation, speculation, and the possibility of closure. For Emily's parents, the sneaker represented more than a clue. It was a resurrection of hope, a tangible signal that their daughter's story was not finished. Their grief, which had simmered in silence for 3 years, erupted into a mix of joy, relief, and renewed fear. The possibility that Emily might still be found alive, or that there might be answers to the questions that had haunted them, shifted every decision, every thought, and every moment of the day. It was a reminder that in cases like these, time may obscure facts but cannot erase the emotional and psychological threads that bind a family to a missing child. The police department, reinvigorated by the discovery, immediately reopened investigative channels. Old files were reviewed with fresh eyes, digital evidence revisited, and previously discounted tips were reassessed. The sneaker, so simple yet profoundly significant, had transformed a stagnant cold case into a live investigation. Community interest surged. Neighbors revisited their own memories and observations from that fateful day, and the forest, once a symbol of indifference and mystery, now held the promise of answers. The landscape of fear and grief that had dominated the neighborhood for years began to shift, replaced by cautious optimism and renewed vigilance. As night fell on the suburban streets, the sneaker resting on the desk at the police station, the emotional landscape of the family and community had irrevocably changed. 3 years of silence, of empty bedrooms and unvisited memories, had ended in a moment so simple yet so profound: a dog, a sneaker, and the quiet persistence of hope. The case was alive again, the story far from concluded, and the questions that had lingered for years now demanded answers. But for the first time since that warm summer day, there was a tangible connection to Emily, a fragment of evidence that suggested the story was not yet finished, that the forest had more to reveal, and that the truth, whatever it might be, was finally within reach. When Rex returned from the woods with the tiny pink sneaker clutched in his mouth, the neighborhood's quiet unease transformed into controlled chaos. Police officers, detectives, and search volunteers converged on the edge of the forest, the same wooded area that had swallowed so many leads 3 years earlier. This time, however, there was a precise starting point, the exact path Rex had taken, the invisible thread guiding them through the dense undergrowth. Officers moved cautiously, scanning every shadow, listening for the faintest snap of twig or rustle of leaves, aware that the difference between discovery and dead end could be measured in inches. The sneaker itself, though weathered, showed little sign of prolonged exposure. Its color, once bright pink and now dulled, had been preserved well enough to suggest it had been kept sheltered for much of the time it was missing. Somewhere, in the tangled wilderness that had been dismissed by so many as impenetrable and meaningless, there was a secret, hidden from the world, waiting to be revealed. Detectives and forensic teams followed Rex as if he were a guide trained for this moment. Every twist in the trail, Every mound of overgrown brush and every fallen tree became a potential clue. Rex moved with purpose, nostrils flaring, paws brushing aside twigs and dried leaves, his energy suggesting he sensed something far beyond the understanding of the human searchers. Behind him, Rex's owner, a local resident who had grown familiar with the dog's instincts over years of walks and training, pointed out subtle markers. A faint indentation in the soil where the dog had paused, a patch of disturbed foliage, indicating that something had been dragged or hidden. Each marker was treated as a potential breadcrumb, leading to a truth long buried, and officers marked the locations meticulously, photographing and mapping each detail. After nearly an hour of moving through the labyrinthine brush, Rex paused near an old rotting fence panel, leaning low to sniff an overgrown, narrow trail barely visible through the dense vegetation. The panel was warped and moss-covered, blending almost perfectly with the forest background. But to those familiar with the area, it was an anomaly, a boundary marker that didn't make sense, separating nothing from nothing, a vestige of a long-forgotten property line. Rex's excitement was palpable, circling repeatedly and barking softly, tail stiff with anticipation. The officers cleared the brush carefully, revealing what appeared at first to be a shallow depression in the ground. It was barely noticeable, hidden by leaves, branches, and the natural detritus of years of neglect. But as they cleared the surrounding brush, a disturbing realization took hold. It was not a natural depression at all. Someone had shaped this space intentionally, carving out an area just large enough for a child, or perhaps a child and an adult, to inhabit. With cautious hands, the team moved aside the camouflaging branches, revealing a makeshift underground shelter. Its construction was crude but deliberate: scrap wood-covered gaps, brush-concealed entrances, and tarps, or what remained of them, lined the walls, partially rotted but still functional enough to offer privacy and protection from the elements. The shelter was small, dark, and suffocating in its intimacy, a stark contrast to the openness of the surrounding forest. Officers and detectives entered one at a time, careful not to disturb potential evidence. The air inside was stale, mingled with the smell of damp wood and soil, but beyond that, it carried a sense of life, a presence that seemed both familiar and ominous. Inside, the scene was haunting. Blankets lay folded yet haphazardly used, as though someone had once slept there but left in haste. Empty cans and wrappers littered the floor, remnants of food that might have sustained a small child, or an adult attempting to disguise the presence of one. Crayon drawings adorned the walls and floor, faint but discernible, capturing simple scenes of houses, families, and animals. Among the items was a small stuffed bear, unmistakably Emily's, worn and frayed from love and time, a token she had carried everywhere. The juxtaposition of everyday childhood innocence against the sinister concealment of the shelter left the officers unsettled. Forensic specialists moved in, documenting each item with care, collecting fibers, and photographing the scene from every angle. The most chilling discovery came when forensic teams found strands of long blonde hair embedded in the blankets and in the soil at the edge of the shelter. DNA samples were taken immediately, and the tension in the room was palpable. Everyone recognized the implications. This was not merely a place where someone had hidden items, it had been occupied. But the timeline was unclear. Had Emily been here for 3 years? Was she kept hidden for part of that time? Or had she been left alone, surviving in isolation? The shelter bore signs of relative freshness. Footprints in the soft soil suggested recent activity. Items had been moved, and certain patches of floor were disturbed in ways inconsistent with decay or natural settling. Whoever had used this space had not entirely vanished without a trace, leaving evidence that could finally illuminate the story that had haunted the neighborhood for years. The discovery sparked an immediate flurry of theories, each more urgent and disturbing than the last. Police debated whether Emily had been alive within the shelter, if she had been alone, or if she had been kept by an abductor who lived nearby. Some officers speculated that someone within the community had been complicit, either knowingly or unknowingly, in maintaining her hidden existence. Others questioned whether Emily had somehow survived on her own, a terrifying thought that implied resilience, desperation, and unimaginable isolation. Every theory was examined and discarded, reevaluated, or expanded upon, as investigators combed the area for additional evidence. footprints leading in and out, more personal items, or traces of someone's daily life. Volunteers and forensic experts worked in tandem to reconstruct the shelter in three-dimensional models, documenting every crack in the wood, every layer of brush, and every crayon drawing for evidence of timelines. Analysts compared soil samples from the shelter with samples from surrounding areas, attempting to determine how long the space had been occupied. DNA collected from the hair was processed urgently, alongside fingerprints from the blanket and walls. Each piece of evidence was weighed, measured, and analyzed, but the case remained enigmatic. The shelter suggested recent habitation, but no body, no immediate signs of Emily herself, and no clear indications of who might have been responsible for maintaining it or abandoning it. Amid the frenzy, the emotional weight of the moment hit hardest for Karen and Michael. They were brought to the site under strict supervision, allowed only a brief, controlled view. Seeing the stuffed bear, the blankets, and the remnants of Emily's personal life reawakened emotions they had carefully compartmentalized for 3 years. Karen wept quietly, pressing a hand to the bear as though she could feel Emily's presence through it. Michael's jaw was tight, eyes scanning every shadow, trying to reconcile the fragments of evidence with the impossible questions in his mind. Was their daughter alive here? Had she survived in isolation? Had she been hidden by someone who lived among them all along? The shelter was both confirmation and torment, tangible proof of proximity and near impossibility. As investigators pieced together the real timeline, the narrative began to shift. The sneaker discovered by Rex was not a relic from 3 years prior, but had likely been deposited more recently, explaining its preserved state. The shelter had been used intermittently, suggesting someone, perhaps a caretaker, perhaps an abductor, had returned periodically, maintaining its secrecy while leaving behind small traces. Each item, each scrap of crayon drawing, became a clue to the rhythms of life within the shelter, pointing to patterns of care, concealment, and survival. The realization that Emily might have been nearby for an extended period ignited new urgency in law enforcement, volunteers, and the parents themselves. The scene inside the shelter was suffocating, not merely from its physical confines, but from the gravity of what it implied. A child, perhaps their child, had occupied this space. A human life, hidden from the world, preserved yet threatened by isolation. The air of mystery and dread that had plagued the neighborhood for 3 long years now felt immediate, tangible, and terrifyingly close. Every officer, volunteer, and parent present understood that this find had the potential to solve years of questions or to deepen the horror, depending on what subsequent investigations revealed. By the time night fell, the shelter had been secured, documented, and cordoned off for forensic analysis. Police returned to the station with preliminary notes and samples, ready to cross-reference the evidence against old witness reports, neighborhood records, and unsolved leads. The community, once resigned to the endless void of uncertainty, watched with a renewed sense of anticipation. Hope, tempered by years of disappointment, was cautious but undeniable. For Karen and Michael, the implications were staggering. Their lives, long dominated by absence and speculation, had been reframed in an instant by a dog, a path, and a hidden shelter. The investigation had shifted from abstract grief to tangible, solvable mystery. And while the future remained uncertain, the shelter, with its signs of recent habitation, had finally provided a bridge, a connection between the missing child and the world that had mourned her. The path that Rex had taken, so ordinary in appearance but extraordinary in consequence, had become the thread that might finally unravel the complex, haunting puzzle of Emily's disappearance, pointing the way toward answers that had eluded the community for far too long. Following the shocking discovery of the hidden shelter, investigators turned their focus inward, retracing every step that Rex had taken and examining the surrounding forest with renewed urgency. Each detail in the shelter became a potential breadcrumb leading to the truth. Fingerprints were lifted from cans and containers, painstakingly cataloged against national databases. The blanket, worn and soiled, yielded DNA traces that would ultimately crack open the case. For the first time in 3 years, the investigation had a tangible direction, a thread that could unravel the mystery that had haunted the town, law enforcement, and Emily's grieving parents alike. The quiet woods, once merely a background to an unsolved disappearance, now loomed as a stage for answers long overdue. Forensic analysts pored over the shelter, meticulously documenting every item. The blankets, drawn with crude, childish art, bore traces of sweat and skin cells. Strands of hair, previously collected, were re-examined, their DNA providing the breakthrough that would link the shelter directly to Emily and, unexpectedly, to another individual. The discovery of Rex's sneaker had initially offered a faint glimmer of hope, but the DNA evidence confirmed that it was not a relic from 3 years prior. Someone had handled it, cared for it, and preserved it, an unsettling clue that indicated Emily's abductor had remained close by, actively controlling the environment around her. Investigators expanded the search radius, moving deeper into the forest, following subtle disturbances in the terrain that suggested movement, habitation, or concealment. Footprints, some barely visible, led to a collapsed storm drain hidden under layers of branches and brush. It was a spot that could easily be mistaken for natural detritus, a location no casual hiker or passerby would notice. The smell, faint but unmistakable, warned the officers of what might lie within. Crouching carefully, they removed the debris to reveal skeletal remains. The discovery sent immediate shockwaves through the team. Forensic identification confirmed what they feared. It was Emily. Dental records, matched against files held since her disappearance, removed any lingering doubt. The child who had vanished so abruptly, whose absence had transformed her parents' lives into a slow burn of grief, had been here, just beyond the reach of those who had been searching. The shock of discovery was compounded when DNA analysis revealed a second, unexpected profile, a middle-aged male whose genetic markers were not in any criminal database, but who matched several reports of trespassing in nearby towns. He was a drifter, someone who had managed to live unnoticed in the forest and surrounding areas for years. Investigation of public records and police files confirmed a pattern of minor offenses, suspicious behavior, and temporary residence near rural homes. Authorities pieced together a profile. He was reclusive, likely experienced in avoiding detection, and, tragically, opportunistic. The drifter had encountered Emily in the brief window when she wandered outside, abducting her and holding her in the makeshift shelter. The forensic team concluded that Emily had survived for several weeks, maybe months, before succumbing to illness or injury. The timeline aligned with the discovery of her belongings. Items like the sneaker had been deliberately preserved by the drifter, suggesting an intent to maintain control and secrecy rather than an accident. Authorities continued mapping the forest, understanding that the abductor had known the terrain intimately. The shelter, the collapsed storm drain, and the surrounding pathways formed a small ecosystem of concealment. Investigators theorized that the drifter had alternated between living in the shelter and moving throughout the forest, using debris, brush, and abandoned structures to remain hidden. Interviews with residents revealed reports of odd sightings over the years. A figure glimpsed near the tree line, unexplained sounds in the woods, and transient fires that no one could trace. In hindsight, all of these clues fit the pattern of a man quietly existing in the margins, a presence that had been overlooked by both the community and law enforcement. Rex, the dog whose simple curiosity had reignited the investigation, became an unlikely hero in the story. His discovery of the sneaker was more than coincidence. It was the key that reopened a case that had seemed destined to fade into memory. Each detail Rex revealed allowed investigators to reconstruct the last days of Emily's life with chilling clarity. The shelter's remains, the skeletal evidence, and the preserved items told a story of confinement, fear, and the quiet control of a predator who had lived undetected for years. Every item, every trace, every path became a thread in a tapestry of horror that the town had barely suspected, buried beneath the ordinary rhythms of suburban life. The revelation that Emily had not simply vanished into the woods, but had been abducted and concealed by someone living undetected nearby, shattered the community's sense of safety. Parents who had previously considered the wooded area only mildly concerning now reevaluated every detail. The reality was stark. The forest did not swallow Emily. A man did, and while the discovery provided answers, it also forced an uncomfortable reflection on proximity, perception, and the subtle ways danger can exist unnoticed. The emotional gravity was immense. Karen and Michael, brought to the site under careful supervision, were confronted with the full scope of what had occurred. Seeing the remains of the shelter, the skeletal evidence, and Rex's role in revealing the truth created a mixture of relief, horror, and heartbreak. Their daughter's fate was finally confirmed, but at a cost beyond imagining. In the days following the discovery, investigators combed through the forest for additional evidence. They located more traces of the drifters' presence, makeshift sleeping areas, discarded items, and signs of brief habitation near streams and brush. By cross-referencing DNA samples and environmental clues, they were able to reconstruct a partial timeline: the initial abduction, the period Emily spent alive in the shelter, the drifters' eventual death from exposure, and the abandonment of the shelter's contents. This sequence filled in the gaps that had haunted investigators for years, transforming speculation into a coherent, tragic narrative. For Karen and Michael, the revelation was simultaneously devastating and clarifying. The uncertainty that had dominated their lives for 3 years, the endless cycle of hope, despair, and imagination, was replaced with concrete, horrifying knowledge. They now understood the circumstances of Emily's disappearance, the brief window in which she survived, and the true nature of the person who had taken her. While no outcome could erase the loss, the truth offered a measure of closure that had been unattainable for so long. Community members, too, grappled with the revelation. The forest, long considered a benign space, had harbored a secret predator. Local parents increased vigilance, neighborhood watch programs were reinstated, and discussions of security and awareness became commonplace. The discovery highlighted a sobering reality. Danger had existed within reach, often invisible, and sometimes overlooked until tragedy illuminated the truth. The narrative that had unfolded in the community's collective imagination, a child lost to the indifferent woods, was replaced with a more sinister, human-centered understanding of risk, control, and secrecy. The final forensic reports provided further clarity. Analysis of Emily's skeletal remains revealed no evidence of trauma consistent with foul play beyond confinement, supporting the theory that her death resulted from illness or exposure within the shelter. The drifter's DNA confirmed that he had maintained possession of her belongings, including the sneaker Rex recovered, intentionally hiding and controlling the narrative of her disappearance. Investigators concluded that there had been no accomplices. The tragedy had been the result of one man's predatory behavior and prolonged concealment. As authorities prepared to release their findings publicly, the narrative came full circle. The story of Emily Carter, her sudden disappearance, the years of silence, the community's fear, and the shocking revelations was now complete in factual terms, though the emotional impact remained profound. Rex's role, seemingly simple, underscored the unpredictability of chance and instinct in uncovering hidden truths. The dog had returned not merely with a sneaker, but with a fragment of justice, reopening a case and allowing closure to take root. For Karen and Michael, the final resolution was an emotional reckoning. They were able to bury Emily with knowledge of her fate, to mourn with clarity, and to confront a narrative that had been obscured for so long. The community, while shaken, could recognize the signs, honor the investigative work, and reflect on the quiet dangers that may exist in familiar spaces. The case became a somber testament to vigilance, the fragility of childhood safety, and the tenacity of both human and animal observation in revealing truth. Ultimately, the woods did not swallow Emily Carter, a man did, and Rex, guided by instinct, courage, and perhaps an unspoken understanding, returned a small sneaker that unlocked a story hidden for 3 long years. The final resolution, while tragic, offered a clarity that had eluded the community since that warm summer afternoon. The investigation closed with answers. The parents could finally confront reality, and the story, though heart-wrenching, served as a stark reminder. Sometimes, the smallest clues, the casual curiosity of a dog, a tiny shoe left behind, can illuminate truths that human eyes have overlooked for years. The echoes of Emily's story would linger in the neighborhood, the forest, and the hearts of all who followed the case. But for the first time, those echoes carried understanding, finality, and the bittersweet relief of answers earned through persistence, intuition, and relentless investigation.